who needs no welcome, the bishop of our diocese, Bishop Jerry Barbarito. Bishop Barbarito, where are you? Bishop, thank you so much for being here. The support and love that we feel as a seminary is felt by so many of you who are members of the churches that make up this wonderful Diocese of Palm Beach. And so, Bishop, we are always so grateful for your presence and your support. We also welcome Archbishop Emeritus Kelleher. Archbishop Kelleher is the Archbishop Emeritus of Kansas City. Archbishop, if you stand so we can welcome you. Our speaker tonight was ordained a priest in the year 1976 for the Archdiocese of St. Louis, has held many diverse ministries, priestly ministries throughout his priesthood. As a parish priest, he worked in the Apostolic Nunciature. He was vice rector of Kenrick Glennon Seminary in St. Louis. He was my own rector at the Pontifical North American College in Rome. He was then an auxiliary Bishop of St. Louis, then Archbishop of Milwaukee, and now the Archbishop of the capital of the world, New York. So Archbishop, Eminence, Cardinal Dolan. He holds a doctorate in church history, and I had the privilege of taking his course on church history. And to make history fun, to make history something that you laugh at for an hour in a course is really a trick, and it's a gift that His Eminence possesses. For anyone who has ever seen an interview, heard a homily, been in his presence, one of the great gifts that the Cardinal offers to the church of the 21st century is his joy, is his enthusiasm for Jesus Christ and the church that he has given us. And Eminence, you honor us at this seminary tonight by your presence. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you, David. Well said. You could have gone on forever.
You know it.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. How are you, Art? Happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you for getting
Thank you. Thanks, sir. How are you? Nice to see you. How are you? Ah, benissimo. Che viva. Ah, bene. Thanks, everybody. You ain't bad yourself. Thank you, everybody. My Lord. Monsignor, I never like to contradict the rector, but I'm the one who's grateful to be here. Thank you very much. You didn't need to thank me. I'm grateful to all of you. I've only been here about 3 hours, and these Monsignor Toops and the wonderful faculty and the seminarians here have already made me extraordinarily welcome. So thank you very much. The honor and the joy that I feel in being with you here at St. Vincent de Paul this evening is enhanced because we gather during the Jubilee year, the 50th anniversary of this magnificent seminary. So happy 50th anniversary, St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary. I feel a special bond, not only as the rector graciously observed, because of my own background in the noble enterprise of priestly formation, but because this seminary, as you know, was founded by priests of the Congregation of the Mission, the Vincentian Fathers. And from St. Louis, we're very grateful to the Vincentians. Our first bishop was a Vincentian, and the Vincentian Fathers, up until relatively recently, were entrusted with the sacred apostolate of priestly formation. So I enjoyed 8 years myself of priestly formation by the Vincentian Fathers. So that kind of adds to my feeling of being home this evening. I'm very grateful for the presence of brother bishops, our own Bishop Barbarito and Archbishop Kelleher, who I extolled at Mass earlier. As Bishop Barbarito will back me up. He's a great patriarch, and we younger bishops, Bishop Barbarito and I, look up to Archbishop Kelleher. Thanks for being here, Archbishop. Monsignor Toops tells me that we're blessed this evening with the company of members of our board, with alumni, with benefactors, with many friends and neighbors. In fact, speaking about friends and neighbors, as I look around at this good crowd this evening, I'm a little self-conscious because, Pope Francis has just warned us not to be airport bishops, that we should stay at home in our own dioceses. But since most of my diocese is down here in Palm Beach now anyway, I kind of feel at home. Oh, the second collection this evening will be for the Archdiocese of New York. So I know we've, beloved seminarians, I acknowledged everybody else, but our deacons and seminarians, both from St. Vincent de Paul and from St. John Vianney College Seminarian in Miami. And I got to say a personal word of affection and appreciation and admiration for Monsignor Toops. I hear from all of you what a sterling job he's doing, and that doesn't surprise me at all. I have to say how very proud, personally, I am of him because he was a student of mine in Rome at the North American College. You seminarians, you will find that a joy of the priesthood after you've been in for a while is when people will come up to you and say, Father, you gave me my first Holy Communion. Or Father, do you remember you taught me religion? Or Father, one time I went to confession to you and you really, what you said hit home. When you see people that even unbeknownst to you, through the grace and mercy of God, you were able to have an impact on. And to see Monsignor Toops this evening now doing such a job, to see one of my students when I was rector doing such a splendid job here, that gives me a lot of pride and satisfaction. So Monsignor Toops, thank you, and I'm very proud of you. See, and doubly proud that the First Lady of the seminary, Mrs. Toops, is here. Is she here? Where's Lynn at? There she is, the First Lady. Stand up, Mrs. Toops. They know you, don't they? That's Monsignor's mom. We love you, and we remember Leon, your husband, who had the greatest autographed baseball collection I've ever seen. And in fact, I got a few of them, remember? So anyway, everybody, Monsignor Toops did me the service of saying, you can speak on whatever you want, okay? Now, not bad, a blank check. He didn't tell me I could speak as long as I wanted, but he said that I could speak on whatever I want. So you know what, but he did suggest, he said, maybe, because you're a historian, maybe a little bit of an historical perspective might be good. So here's what I thought I'd do, everybody, because I think it's pretty much on all of our minds. I thought I'd take a look at the recent three popes. Would that be okay? The Catholic Church has been immensely blessed with tremendous pontiffs, but the last three, Blessed John Paul II, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, and now our beloved Pope Francis, they have been particular gems in the crown of Holy Mother Church. And I thought it might be good for me just to take a look at those three popes for about 40 or 45 minutes. Is that okay? If it isn't, too bad, okay, because I'm doing it. So I could only do card tricks for 5 minutes or so. But, and you know what I've entitled this? And I got to be honest with you, I've been working on this talk for a while. I keep developing it, expanding it, changing it. I've given different versions of it a time or two, and I keep working on it. I've entitled it Soul, Mind, and Heart. Now think about this, everybody. Every institution, every entity, every family, every corporation, every living organism needs a soul, needs a mind, and needs a heart. And so does our supernatural family that we call the church. The church needs a soul, the church needs a mind, and the church needs a heart. And I wonder if a particular hermeneutic to help us appreciate the gift that the Lord has given us in our recent three Holy Fathers would be to consider John Paul II as the soul of the church. Benedict XVI is emphasizing the mind, and our beloved Pope Francis is emphasizing the heart. You want to give it a whirl and see if it works? Hear me out here about these three popes, all right? Blessed, soon-to-be Saint John Paul II. I would contend to you that Blessed John Paul II enhanced and intensified the soul the soul of the church. When he visited the United States in 1979, a visit that captured the imagination of the nation, when he visited the White House, then President Jimmy Carter referred to John Paul II as the soul of the world. When he visited in 1987, during a visit, by the way, which took him here to the Archdiocese of Miami, Billy Graham called him a providential prescription for humanity's exhausted soul. And just 2 years before he died, the distinguished rabbi who was a leader in Jewish Catholic relations, Rabbi Gilbert Rosenthal, when he was asked by the press, why are you going to see this Pope? He's so old, he's so exhausted, he's so weak. And Rabbi Rosenthal said, we're not going to see his body, we're going because we love his soul. John Paul II enhanced the soul of the church. I would propose to you that the central mission, can you all hear me okay? Is this picking up on Senior Tubes? Is this all right? The central mission of John Paul II, I would propose, is the recovery of the primacy of the spiritual. The recovery of the primacy of the spiritual. He literally believed the mandate of Jesus Christ, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and everything else will work out. John Paul II, when he came in 1978, and some of you old-timers like me are going to remember that, the church was in some doldrums. The church was in some crisis. And John Paul II believed that if we take care of the soul, if we can restore the spiritual priority of the church, everything else is going to fall in its place. Because he believed the words of Jesus, seek ye first the kingdom, everything else is going to work out. Now, he himself, blessed John Paul II, bordered, I believe, on the mystic. Okay, anybody who had the honor, and some of you have, I did a number of times, anybody who had the honor of attending his early morning mass, every morning in his private chapel at 7 a.m., he'd have his own mass, and there would always be a couple dozen people that were invited. And when you'd get there about 10 to 7, when you were ushered in, he was literally locked in prayer at his prie-dieu in front of the Blessed Sacrament, where he had been since 6 a.m., all right, in prayer. And as you'd sit down close to him, you could see that he was not conscious of anything but his union with God through prayer. And you would hear him sigh, and you would hear him groan, and you would sometimes see a tear in his eye, and you could tell that this was a man of deep mystical prayer. Cardinal McCarrick tells the story of when he visited the Archdiocese of Newark. This would have been in 1995. He was then Archbishop McCarrick, the Archbishop of Newark, that he was running an hour and 15 minutes late. He was in New York, all right? And they were waiting for the helicopter to cross the Hudson. And it was a pouring rainstorm. And there were 100,000 people waiting for John Paul at Giant Stadium. And the helicopter finally came, and Archbishop McCarrick was so eager to get the Pope into the Pope-mobile to get him to the stadium. And everybody else came out and no Pope. And finally, John Paul's secretary said, there's no rushing him because he is praying his breviary. A man of intense prayer, you see, who knew that if he was going to restore the soul of the church, his soul had to be a burning furnace of charity. Maybe it was, and I'm sure that his own deep interior life, in many ways, was due to the Polish culture, which is high-octane Catholicism, okay? Historians of Poland will say that the Catholic faith, the Catholic spirit, is literally in the cobblestones of Poland, you see, and that's the beautiful culture in which our beloved John Paul II grew up. But it's probably also due his own intense spiritual life, his own soul. It's probably also due to his biography. You know that he was born in 1920, when Poland was literally decimated in the ruins of World War I. All right, there had been no Poland. I mean, there was always a Poland, but there had been no political entity on the map up until World War I. And then World War I, as usual, was used as a drag race with Russian and German troops going through, leaving Poland devastated. It's there he grew up. in that horror and that rebuilding. His own mother died when he was early. His sister and brother died. He found his own father dead on the floor. And then, when he was 19 years old, came the day in his life that he says in his autobiography he will never forget, on September 1st, 1939, as he is going to the university and looks up and sees the German Luftwaffe come in to walk over Poland, leading to 5 years more of war and devastation. His Jewish friends were taken away. His seminarians friends were taken away. He himself, coming home from work at a chemical factory, was hit by a truckload of German soldiers and left for dead at the side of the road, into a clandestine seminary. Finally, the defeat of Germany in 1945, only to find Poland one of those unfortunate countries that the historians say lost the war twice, as the forces of Stalin and Russian atheistic communism come in, leading again to decades of totalitarian oppression in Poland. It was in this suffering, it was in this harassment, it was in this oppression that John Paul II's own spiritual life was deepened as he became a man, as his biographer George Weigel calls him, of immense intestinal fortitude that was based, of course, upon his own spiritual life. It was almost as if he had learned firsthand, everybody, what the psalmist says: "Only in God is my soul at rest. Do not fear those who can kill the body. Fear those only who can extinguish the life of the soul." In John Paul II's own life, we have the primacy of the spiritual, and no wonder his first words, remember? His first words, "Non abbiate paura," do not be afraid. This was a man who, from a natural perspective, had every right in the world to be scared to death. And yet his first words to a world skeptical about this young Polish archbishop, "Be not afraid." Will we ever forget on his second journey back to Poland? Remember, in 1983, you talk about a man of courage and fortitude, a man of the soul. Will we ever forget in 1983, Poland under martial law, all right? Poland with 1 million Russian troops with bayonets standing there ready, and John Paul arrives. And here to meet him is Jaruzelski, the military dictator, who from an earthly point of view had all the power of the world behind him. And here is John Paul II, who has nothing but his soul and his faith. And as they're standing there at the airport, whose knees are knocking? Jaruzelski's. Literally, his knees are knocking, and the papers are shaking as he's reading a greeting to John Paul II. And John Paul II's serenity, peace, courage, fortitude, a man of the soul. So when he becomes our Pope in 1978, his mission statement becomes to restore the exhausted soul of the church. And the way he did that, of course, is the only way anybody can do it. His restoration of the exhausted soul of the church was to recover the primacy of Jesus. The primacy of Jesus, that Jesus himself is at the center of our life, and that the basic call that every single person faces is discipleship with Jesus Christ. When George Weigel, who wrote the two masterful biographies, his first one, Witness to Hope, when he said he didn't know what to call the preface. That's very important for an author. What are you going to call the preface? He had finished the book. What was he going to call the preface? Was he going to call it the priest? Because John Paul II loved his priesthood. The bishop, the philosopher, the poet, the theologian, the Pole. What was he going to? What word was he going to use in the preface to describe John Paul II? And he simply used the title, the disciple. The disciple, that John Paul II saw himself first and foremost as a disciple of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the best friend of his soul. After a year, when André Froussard, the French intellectual, wrote his life, remember what Froussard said? Everybody's saying we got a pope from Poland. We don't. We got a pope from Palestine, because we got a pope who wants to bring us back to the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where everybody would hear ringing in his ear the call of Jesus Christ to those first disciples, "Come, follow me," to see the face of Jesus in the Holy Eucharist, in the sacraments, in the church, in our prayer, in the poor, and in the church, to restore Jesus Christ to the center of the church and therefore restore the primacy of the spiritual in the life of the church. That beautiful quote that almost sums up everything that John Paul II taught. Jesus Christ is the answer to the question posed by every human life. The centrality, the utter priority of Jesus Christ. Such was his emphasis, I believe, on the Blessed Mother, a deep, tender devotion to the Mother of Jesus, all right? Calling Mary the first disciple, restoring that ancient saying of the fathers that before she was mother, she was disciple, and she would not have been mother if she was not first disciple. So Mary, our Blessed Mother, as the icon of discipleship, so important in the program of John Paul II to restore the exhausted soul of the church. And I think, secondly, that helps us understand why John Paul II was so almost frantic in wanting to make saints. All right? When Father David and I were in Rome, and one of the times he had a canonization of an American, St. Catherine Drexel, and I remember the reporter said to me, "Isn't the Pope being unrealistic in holding up all these examples of heroic sanctity for the world, and in saying that these are models that we can all become like these saints?" And I said, he's not being unrealistic at all. He's extraordinarily realistic in teaching us that every single one of us are called to be saints. And with the grace and mercy of God, sanctity, heroic sanctity, is possible. I complimented Archbishop Kelleher at Mass because I remember very well the day of recollection he gave when I was vice rector of Kenrick on Pastoros Dabo Vobis, which was the apostolic exhortation of Blessed John Paul II on seminary formation. And I remember Archbishop Kelleher drawing attention to a quote from Pastoros Dabo Vobis that I think is pivotal to understanding John Paul II's enterprise of restoring the soul of the church. In Pastoros Dabo Vobis, John Paul II says, the great temptation of contemporary men and women is to stress having and doing rather than being. Now think about that. Only a philosopher could say that, right? John Paul II says, you know why the world's in trouble? Because we think having stuff and doing a lot of things are more important than just being. You see? You can restore confidence. You can restore identity if you emphasize being rather than having and doing. And when you talk about the life of the soul, you're mostly speaking of being with God. Was that ever more evident, everybody, in what has to be one of the more dramatic events of contemporary history? In fact, I'm not speaking for myself here. I'm speaking about June 1st to June 10th, 1979, when John Paul II returned to Poland for his first trip, a trip they never thought would happen. It's been called 9 days that changed the world. Gorbachev, 20 years afterwards, said it was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. And Henry Kissinger told me that what Churchill did for the world in his leadership in World War II, John Paul II did for the world in his leadership those 9 days in returning to Poland. 2/3 of the nation came to see him. And by that experience, everybody, a word became world renowned. And not only the word, but the actuality became renowned. And that word, of course, was solidarity. Solidarity. Now, we usually think of it as the term applied to the labor union, solidarity, and yes, it was. But the concept preceded the union, the idea of the union. And what am I talking about? For 9 days, John Paul II never mentioned the word Russia. He never mentioned the word communism. He never was he never was overtly political. But what he did was generate an experience of solidarity. And what do I mean? For 9 days, the people of Poland, all of a sudden, for the first time perhaps since Hitler invaded, were able to lift up their heads and look around. And they discovered we are not alone. We are not just a number. We are not a cog in a machine. We have a name. We have a heritage. We have a culture. We have a destiny. We're not animals. We're not robots. We're not a mere machine. We are not just on a waiting list for the gulag. We are not just a hollow, empty body. We have a soul. We have a soul. We have faith. We have religion. We have a church. And, will we ever forget it? The closing mass in the square at Krakow, 2 million people. And John Paul II had only begun to preach. He had preached for about 2 minutes. And all of a sudden the chant started. Remember? Remember the chant? It started with maybe a couple hundred. And it started resounding and resounding as that immense throng simply began to shout out, "We want God. We want God." It went on for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. We want God. The attendants came over to John Paul and said, "Perhaps you'll calm the crowd down." And Pope John Paul, of course, just smiled and said, "Are you nuts? This is what I came for, all right?" It went on for 17 minutes. 2 million people, we want God. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, when the KGB archives were opened, and when they found the telegram back from the KGB leader after that mass, he said, "We lost. We lost. It's over." 2 million people in Poland shouting out, "We want God." Their soul had been restored through a son of Poland, himself with a vibrant spiritual life, returns home to restore their exhaustion. Through the primacy of the spiritual, solidarity was born, and the rest is history. We see it. Let me conclude John Paul II here. We saw it incarnate in him, the power of his own soul in his own suffering. He let us watch him die as we saw this amazingly strong, daring man shrivel up and die in front of us, not to be deterred. I remember when I was Archbishop in Milwaukee, and after a Sunday Mass at the cathedral, a newly married couple came up to me and they said, "Oh, we're leaving today for Rome." And I said, are you going to meet the Holy Father? And the wife said, "Well, how do we do it?" And I said, "Well, if you bring your marriage license, and if you go to the general audience, I'll write, and you can get in and you can meet the Pope." She was excited. He was more interested in the restaurants, okay? Which, by the way, I could help him with that too, all right? But, so I could give him a list of those too. But, so I wrote, and sure enough, I see him 2 weeks later when they're back. And this time, he's got a tear in his eye. And he said, "Archbishop Dolan, thank you. Thanks to you, we had box seats. And thanks to you, we got to meet John Paul." And he said, "It was one of the most moving experiences of my life." I said, "Tell me what moved you, meeting the Pope?" He said, "Not really that." I said, "Well, just seeing the crowds there, not really that." I said, "What really moved you?" He said, "Well, when the Pope came and we were very close to him and we could see him, and when he started to talk," he said, "after about half a minute, I saw him reach into his pocket and take his handkerchief and wipe his mouth because he was drooling." He said, "I saw the Pope drooling." And he said, "That moved me so very much to see this great man who had the courage, who had the soul to keep on going." Do you remember, everybody? It's still playing, I think, in New York if you come see me. And if you get to Broadway, Les Miserables. Les Miserables, the great musical. You know of it. Do you remember the bishop in Les Miserables? Finally, a bishop comes off okay in a Broadway So the bishop in Les Miserables confronts the hero, Jean Valjean, remember? Simply by saying to Jean, you have a soul. That's all the bishop said to him, you have a soul. And it was that recognition that introduced him, Jean, to a life of conversion and transformation. John Paul II had a soul, and he restored the soul of the church. How about the mind? Soul, mind, our beloved Benedict XVI. The church needs a mind. The church needs a brain. The church needs an intellect. The church needs reason. And Pope Benedict gave us that in spades, didn't he? Because we had a man who was a professor. We have a man, a towering intellect. We have a man grounded in philosophy and theology. And he reminded the church, and by the way, a world that is growing more and more skeptical, that faith and reason are not enemies. Faith and reason are allies. And quoting St. Anselm, he said, strange would be the God whose greatest supernatural gift to us, our faith, and greatest natural gift to us, our mind, were at odds. He said they're not. They're allies. They're friends. That message, of course, enhancing the life of the mind, as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, did so radiantly. That enhancing of the intellect of the church was so timely, you see, in a world of the new atheism, where a secular culture on steroids attempts to reduce belief to a private hobby at best, or a silly, oppressive superstition at worst. Reason itself, Benedict reminds us, our brain itself, not even needing faith at the beginning, reason itself shows us truth, shows us the truth and hints at the divine. And once reason is in partnership with the supernatural gift of faith, sparks begin to fly and fire is discovered a second time. Because faith and reason allied, Benedict will tell us, affirms all that is good and true and beautiful in the human project. And Benedict would remind us of the great heritage that we have as Catholics, that the church is the engine. The church becomes the engine of all genuine human progress. And the church's rich intellectual tradition is hardly a museum piece, but as timely as they come. So what Benedict would do is to renew the intellectual wattage of the church through what he called affirmative orthodoxy. That yes, the church is in to the protection of the patrimony of truth. You bet the church is into that big time. That's our sacred responsibility. But this orthodoxy is saying yes, yes, everything that is good and beautiful and noble in the human project, the church affirms, the church encourages. The church only says no when somebody else says a no, denying something that is good and decent and virtuous about human life and dignity. That's the only time the church says no. And I don't know what you're studying now, you philosophers at St. John Vianney, but two no's make a yes. So when the church says no to something that is negating the dignity of the human person and the sanctity of human life, those two no's turn into a big yes about the human person and human life. What's being called his September legacy, where each September during his 8 years, his 8-year pontificate would find him Regensburg, we can't forget that, Paris, London, the Bundestag in his own beloved Germany, when he would give such a beaming, highly intellectual treatment of a topic of pertinence to culture that would still have very practical implications. For instance, in what he called interior ecology. Hear Benedict out. Benedict says in one of his September addresses, he said, you know what? He said, the world today loves to talk about the environment and loves to talk about the ecology of the planet, and rightly so. And the world has learned the hard way that if we tamper with the ecology, the environment, if we introduce things that are toxic into the environment, okay, or bad things happen because we can't tamper with what God has given us in the environment. So Benedict would praise ecology and say contemporary men and women have discovered this environmental, ecological sensitivity. But then was his brilliance. He jumped from that exterior ecology to interior ecology. And he said, you know what? The same applies within. God has implanted within the human person an ecology, an environment, a natural balance, a beautiful choreography. And if we tamper with it, if we introduce toxic things into it, if we contradict the nature that God has given us, poisonous, disastrous things begin to happen inside as much as they do on the outside. Benedict would remind us of, I think he called it from ontology, all right, to acting. You know what this means. Ontology means we're back at the being. Benedict says that you go in our whole Catholic moral life, we go from the is to the ought. So he says, let's concentrate on the is of things. Let's concentrate on what things really are, as we know from reason and faith. And if we concentrate on the is of things, we'll come to the ought. What do you mean? Benedict says, well, let's talk about the is of human life. If the baby in the womb is alive, if the baby in the womb is a human person, there's the isness, well, then we ought to protect it. If marriage is the lifelong, life-giving, faithful union of a man and woman, if that's what marriage is, well, then we ought to protect it. If an immigrant is a child of God, made in his image and likeness, there's the is, then we ought to respect and care for him or her. We go from the is to the ought in this beautiful symphony, this intellectual symphony of Benedict XVI. He reminds us, folks, Benedict does, to make sure to avoid the two extremes. One extreme, of course, is reason without faith. We call that rationalism. Reason without faith. Reason without faith, Benedict says, leads to the gang of robbers and the Berlin bunker. The dictatorship of relativism, where the only constant is the subjective truth of my wants, my needs, my convenience, my viewpoint, my opinion. A nasty rationalism is one extreme. The other extreme is a faith without reason. A faith without reason, that's called fideism, leads to a shallow, knee-jerk, incredible, simplistic mind control, a hollow fideism that will not hold up to the scrutiny of reasoning people. And Benedict says, bring on the via media, the middle way of Catholic wisdom. The Catholic wisdom of faith and reason in an alliance of checks and balances that leads to genuine freedom, truth, and happiness as the good, the true, and the beautiful are embraced. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in a recent talk in New York, he was the chief rabbi of England. He spoke about his love and his respect for Benedict's intellectual heritage. And he especially said that he believes Benedict XVI is calling believing Catholics and Jews, to a creative minority, to be a creative minority in the world. Let me read what Rabbi Sachs says. The task of this creative minority in the Jewish Christian tradition is always to challenge the idols of the age, whatever the idols, whatever the age. The idols of our age, Rabbi Sachs says, are many. Materialism, individualism, consumerism, relativism, a loss of the sense of the sanctity of marriage, and the non-negotiable dignity of the human person. So, being a minority does not mean you believe truth is relative. What it means is that every age has its idols, and it needs prophetic voices to show the way to a deeper faith. And folks, Benedict XVI was such a prophetic voice by emphasizing the mind of the church, the reason. And finally, Pope Francis restoring the heart of the church. When, right after he was elected, you had Cardinal O'Brien here, right? So he already broke the seal and told you all about the conclave. Good, I can do that then. All right? Very good, thank you. Would you put an olive in that, please? I'm not supposed to talk about the conclave. You already know a bunch of it. You know I lost. All right, we know that. As we walked in, they have that room where the new pope goes to vest, and I saw the 3 sizes, and the biggest size was not XXL, so I knew I didn't have a chance. So, obviously, when the new pope is elected, the Cardinal Dean says, "Do you accept?" And once he says yes, the second question is, "By what name will you be known?" And Cardinal Bergoglio, after he had said yes, said Francis, and then he quickly added, of Assisi. I guess he thought, because he was a Jesuit, some of us would think it was Francis Xavier, but he said Francis of Assisi. And once he said that, you know what those very words, Francis of Assisi, mean. The heart, all right? The heart. These are simple things, folks, but that's what life is made up of. When he came out after putting on his white cassock, and the protocol was for us to then line up to go up to him one by one, and we saw him, he goes to the front like here, and we begin to line up, and all of a sudden he begins to move very quickly down the center aisle. And we're kind of looking at him thinking, what's going on here? I thought to myself, where's he? Is he going to the bathroom or what? I said, if he is, where's it at? Because I need it too. We had been in there for a while. But he went down immediately to the 2 cardinals who were in wheelchairs. Now, that is about as simple and ordinary as you can get. But as you know, courtesy is no longer ordinary, is it? Courtesy in our culture is extraordinary. And this is the man that right away saw those 2 cardinals and went down to them. Now, and then he says something remarkable. By that time, the other attendants and all were coming in. And he had greeted 2 or 3 cardinals, and the attendants were there. And then he stops and he says, "Brother Cardinals," he said, I'm going to eat with you tonight, so I'll get to see all of you then. He said, "I hear it's raining outside, and I don't want to keep those people waiting." So he went out to the crowd. Now, once again, a very touching, simple sign of a man with a heart that breaks a tragedy. Think of his heart-rending remarks with the war and the horror in Syria. Think about his own visit to Lampedusa after the sinking of the ship, drowning hundreds of refugees. A heart like the Sacred Heart of Jesus that goes out to those at the side of the road and encourages us, especially us priests, to always be out of the sanctuary and off to the periphery to find those who have been left behind. A heart that tells us as priests that we should have the smell of our sheep on our boots. A heart that encourages us to risk and to dare, and to not even be afraid to have accidents, because the Lord understands and heals if we're doing it out of love for Him. A heart that has a particularly burning solicitude for the poor. I'm reminded when I listen to Pope Francis, I'm reminding Monsignor Toops and I on the ride in from the airport, I always remember when it was a summer in Rome, and there's not too many people in Rome in the summer, I had to stay as rector. And for some reason, Monsignor Toops was there, David, at the time. I don't know if you were between travel or whatever. And it was August 10th, which is the Feast of St. Lawrence. And I said, you want to go on pilgrimage to walk to the Church of St. Lawrence, which was a good 6 or 7 miles, wasn't it? So we walked to the Church of St. Lawrence. We took a cab back, all right, but we walked, and I always remember the story, when I hear Pope Francis, his heart breaking for the poor. I remember the story about Lawrence, when the emperor said to Lawrence, I want the treasure of the church, or I will unleash a persecution. Remember? The Roman emperor says to Lawrence, the deacon, I want the treasures, the riches of the church, and I give you 3 days to bring them to me, or I will unleash a persecution. And 3 days later, the attendants go into the emperor and says, Lawrence is out there. And the emperor says, does he have the treasures, the riches of the church? And the attendant says, he says that he doesn't. And when the emperor goes to the balcony, he looks into the courtyard. There indeed is Lawrence with the blind and the crippled and the beggars and the sick and the aged and the infirm and the orphan, the poor. And Lawrence says to the emperor, here are the riches of the church. That's the heart, too, of Pope Francis. This is a heart, friends, that is tender. Do you remember his installation on the Feast of St. Joseph, March 19th? And remember, he spoke about tenderness. He said, God is tender with us. He pictured St. Joseph tenderly embracing his virgin wife and tenderly holding the newborn Savior of the world. And he says, let's not be afraid to be tender with one another, with ourselves, because God is tender with us. I was sitting next to the Archbishop of Vienna, who's one of the great intellectuals in the church, Cardinal Schönborn, and he's got tears in his eyes. I love the homily. Remember, it was 11 minutes. Not bad, okay? I thought, I'm gonna like this guy, an 11-minute homily, okay? And Cardinal Schönborn turns to me, he says, Tim, he speaks like Jesus. And I said, Chris, I think that's the job description, all right? But he spoke, he spoke, he was, afterwards, we had one of those I had one of these interminable press conferences, and the journalist that interviewed me would be well known to you if I would say her name, which I won't because it was rather private. And she, before the interview, she says to me, you know, Cardinal Dolan, I spend my days covering, she said, I'm very moved by that, by his homily. She said, I spend my days covering war and violence and drugs and murder and corruption and crime and starvation and epidemics. And she said, here this man speaks about tenderness. Tenderness. She says, I needed to hear that. The tender heart at the heart of the church. His friends in Argentina, for instance, Rabbi Skorka, say that when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, one of the more complicated, diverse archdioceses of the world, he was all embracing, you see, that all sides and all people and all faiths felt at home with Cardinal Bergoglio because his heart was so big and so tender. He reminds me, everybody, of Bernini's colonnades. You know, at St. Peter's Square, if you see the masterful colonnades that embrace Bernini's sculptural masterpiece, that embrace St. Peter's Square. And Bernini said, these are the arms of Holy Mother Church that are reaching out to embrace the world and bring the world into the church. He tells us that this church with a heart is not some NGO, it's not some cold institution, it's not just some agenda, it's not some ethical society. This church is a person, Jesus, who has a heart, and this church is a family. The church is a family with a heart. And I'm wondering, everybody, I obviously can't go into the detail with Francis that I did with John Paul and Benedict because we're not even within a year of the pontificate. But I wonder when Monsignor Toops invites for the 60th anniversary somebody to speak on Francis, I wonder if we'll be able to say that this was a pope who worked to build and to restore the heart to the church. This was an ecclesial pope who wanted to restore the luster of the church. Fellas, at St. John Vianney and here at St. Vincent de Paul, my brother priests and bishops will back me up, as well the lay people here tonight, because they see it in their kids and grandkids. The greatest pastoral problem we face today is to remind our people that Jesus and his church are one. Our people tell us they don't have trouble with God, they don't have trouble with Jesus, but they don't need the church. Our people want to believe, but they don't want to belong. They want a spirituality, but they don't want a religion. They want a general without an army. They want a shepherd where they're the only sheep in the fold. They want to belong to a family where they're the only child, okay? They want Christ without the church, and you and I know that's impossible. That's impossible. And to restore that equation between Jesus and his church is perhaps the most burning pastoral priority that we have today. And I wonder if I'm convinced that Francis knows that deep down. And if he can restore the heart of the church, he will remind people that the heart of the church and the Sacred Heart of Jesus are identical. And I wonder if he's going to begin to speak about a new model of the church. Remember Avery Dulles, his classic textbook? Maybe you still use it in your ecclesiology courses here at St. Vincent, Models of the Church, when he went through those different models. I wonder if Pope Francis is going to add a new one. The church as our family. The church is our family. The church is our family, isn't it? God's our Father. Jesus, he's our Lord and Savior, but he's our older brother. The saints, the angels, are our brothers and sisters. Here on earth, we have a Holy Father. Mary is our mother. The church is our mother. And we're united with everybody in the church through a bond of grace and mercy that is stronger than blood. The church is our family. And if you notice, Pope Francis is not afraid, and here he's got immense credibility, he's not afraid to tell us that the church is a dysfunctional family. I've never met a family that wasn't. Have you? If you want to see one, you're invited to Thanksgiving dinner at my house next Thanksgiving. We all know our human families are wounded. There's dysfunction there. There's things we're embarrassed about. There's things we do wrong. There's things we regret. There's things that hurt in our human families, and it's true in our supernatural family, the church as well, because we're sinners. So when he's asked, when the journalist says, Pope Francis, who are you? He simply says, I'm a sinner. All right? I'm a sinner. So the church is a family. The church with a heart. So guess what? Ecclesia semper reformanda. The church is always undergoing renovation and expansion. You ever heard that term before? Did I get it right? Did I say it right? I know I'm going to make the flyers now, okay? No, Ecclesia semper reformanda. The church is always in need of reform. Right now, my good people from St. Patrick's know this, we're undergoing a big repair at St. Patrick's Cathedral to the tune of $180 million, all right? When it came to midnight mass, about a month ahead of time, the TV people says, well, I guess we're going to have midnight mass somewhere else. This is nationally, internationally broadcast because obviously the scaffolding's up in here. I said, are you nuts? We're having it here. I want the people to see the scaffolding, all right? I want them to know St. Patrick's is under repair and renewal. Yeah, because I'm thinking it'll generate interest, but you know what? Because the church, that church with a small c, is only an example of the church with a big C that is always in need of repair. So we got a family, a supernatural family, the church, and we need perhaps some bypass surgery on the heart because we got a church as a heart, and Francis is emphasizing that. We're part of a family. We're born into the church. We're nourished at the church. We want to die within her warm embrace. Remember the great, you've heard of Graham Greene, the great Catholic novelist. Remember his masterpiece, The Power and the Glory? And remember, it was about a priest in Mexico in persecution. This priest, he's not the best priest. He's called the whiskey priest. All right, the whiskey priest, because he's a drunk. But he's a very faithful priest. And he's only a couple hours in front of the army who's trying to hunt him down because he won't renounce his faith. This whiskey priest, the poor fella. And he's finally given some sanctuary in a barn by an Episcopalian family. And the teenage girl of the family is kind of fascinated by him. So as she brings the water out and some bread, she starts talking to him, and she finally says, well, why don't you just deny your faith? Why don't you just renounce your faith? Why don't you just leave this church? And the whiskey priest, with all his flaws, he says, well, I can't. I can't leave the church. The church is me. It's in me. It's part of me. And he could see the girl was trying to figure it out. And she says, oh, you mean it's sort of like a birthmark. A birthmark that you can't get rid of. And the whiskey priest says, yeah, it's like a birthmark. Profound Catholic sense there, folks. See, the church is part of it. Just like we're part of a human family, we're part of a supernatural family, and that family is a heart. And Pope Francis is doing his darndest to restore that heart. This is too simple. But somebody says, with John Paul II, the church was on retreat. With Benedict XVI, the church was on sabbatical, restoring its mind. And now with Francis, he's saying, okay, our soul is restored, our mind is restored, get to work, all right? As he's restoring a heart to the church. I think, listen to this poem. I love Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet. Listen to these lines from The Wreck of the Deutschland, one of his classics. Now, when you hear the word Britain, replace it with church. Gerard Manley Hopkins is tough to read because he has all this alliteration, so bear with me. Let him Easter in us, be a dayspring to the dimness of us, be a crimson crescented east, more brightening her rare dear Britain, as his reign rolls, pride rose, prince of us, high priest, our hearts, charities, hearths, fire, our thoughts, chivalries, throngs, Lord. Now, here's my worry. Soul, head, and heart. All popes got them, all three. So I'm afraid I may have exaggerated, maybe being too simple here, but I think you get the point. I mean, obviously, John Paul, yeah, the soul, but he also emphasized the head and the heart, as all the popes do. I don't know if I'm as simplistic here, although I admired his article. I forget who it was. He did a similar analysis as mine, but he uses the Wizard of Oz. And he said, it's like the last three popes. It's like the Tin Man wanting courage. That was John Paul II, giving us courage. The lion the scarecrow needed a brain, and Benedict gave us a brain, and the lion wanted a heart. And Francis has given us a heart. We love all of them, and we never want to praise one pope at the expense of another, because the popes are a gift, a unique gift to us as Catholics. The popes are Peter, the successor of Peter. They're the source of earthly unity within our family, the church, and that unity needs a soul and a mind and a heart. I sometimes wonder if the world recognizes the uniqueness and the richness of the papacy more than we do. Right now, I just met with our new mayor in New York, who's Mayor de Blasio, who by his own admission, is not a religious man and who has views that are certainly very at odds, some views that are at odds with the church. But he says to me that he feels the most powerful man in the world today is Pope Francis. Did you ever think you'd have the president of Russia quoting the Pope? Because sometimes the world recognizes the unique authority of the Pope more than we do. Let me close, as I'm trying to enhance our appreciation for the papacy itself, seen so beautifully and brilliantly in our last three popes, with what I think is a great description by George Bernard Shaw in his preface to St. Joan. He says, compared to our infallible, he puts it in quotation marks, compared to our infallible democracies, our infallible doctors, our infallible scholars and scientists, our infallible judges, and our infallible governments, the Pope is on his knees in the dirt, confessing his ignorance before the throne of God, and in the end has more right to the claim than all the others combined. Thanks, everybody. Good being with you. All right. Thanks. Bravo. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Bravo. You do okay time-wise?
Yeah, let's do about 15 minutes of questions,
Sure,
and then we'll do it.
Thanks. Thank you. All right.
If you'd be seated, we will take about 15 minutes of questions. Then for those that need to leave, we will also have a reception if you need to stretch your legs and have a little refreshment. But we'll also take some pictures after those 15 minutes of questions in different groupings. We'll take a picture of the priests and the religious and the seminarians, and then invite people up by diocese so they can have a memory of this great night with His Eminence as we celebrate our 50th anniversary. So I'd like to open up just for a few minutes of questions. Some of you may have some burning desires. Raise your hand in the back, Dr. Lopez.
Tony.
Tony.
How are you? Tony's from New York.
That's right.
As is Bishop Barbarito, right?
Brooklyn.
New York, right? New York City.
I wonder whether you could perhaps say something about, going back to John Paul II, his mystical soul, if to some extent his love and even his work on St. John of the Cross, who was a great mystic, may have something to do also with that mystical soul that you talked about.
Well, that's for sure. You're right, Tony. He was well versed in what we might call the Carmelite tradition in the church. There's different strains of spirituality in our Catholic family. The Franciscan spirituality, the Dominican spirituality, Benedictine, Jesuit. But the Carmelite spirituality particularly stresses mystical union with God in the different steps to prayer, which St. John of the Cross described as an ascent, closely allied with St. Teresa the Great, St. Teresa of Jesus, another great Carmelite saint. And, as Tony would let you know, that St. John of the Cross would believe that this mystical union with God through Jesus, empowered by the Holy Spirit, usually comes only through deeper union with the cross, through suffering, through suffering. And that it's only achieved, never by us, only by God's great grace and mercy, only after intense perseverance that usually has more days of nothing than something. So that would be the great insight of St. John of the Cross, which John Paul was very influenced by. So you're right, Tony. I think you're right. Mm-hmm. Didn't you, Monsignor, you did your Was it your license on the totus tuus of John Paul? Yeah. How did you you're not 65 yet. How did you become a Monsignor? What is this?
Cardinal Dolan, what would you say is one of the greatest challenges that Pope Francis faces as the Pope, especially in regard to his relationship to the American Catholic Church?
Well, I mentioned one, and I believe this is the one we all face, namely to restore what the church is all about. That's the big pastoral problem today. People don't think they need the church. They tell us they believe in God. Most of them believe in Jesus, but they don't have any use for the church. Now, I don't want to exaggerate that. The Pew Research Center tells us that still, thank God, 80% of Catholics remain faithful to the church. They might be lackluster in their faith, but they remain faithful. But you know, the bad news is that more and more people leave the church. We've always had what we call fallen aways, remember? That was the term we used to use. There were always those fallen aways, but if you would say to them, well, you're not a Catholic anymore, they'd punch you. They'd say, of course we're Catholic, we're not too good. We don't go that much, but sure we're Catholic. Well, that's not true anymore. Jimmy Breslin, the Irish pundit in New York, used to say, well, sure, all Catholics fall away now and again, but they're only one chest pain away from going back. Okay? But that's,
Eminence, we have a third theologian with a question back here.
That's not true anymore, is it? And I think the great challenge is to restore the luster of the church. To restore, why do we need the church? And that's why I was getting at that I think we need the church supernaturally the same way we need a family naturally. And you might say, well, I didn't choose to be in the church. Well, you didn't choose to be in a natural family either, did you? You kind of are stuck with it. We're not the only ones suffering, by the way. You got me on a roll here, Monsignor, sorry. The Pew Research Center tells us that every so-called inherited religion is going through this. What are the inherited religions? Judaism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Islam. In other words, the main way you become a Catholic is you're born into a Catholic family. You inherit it, which is a beautiful concept. Because Jesus said, you didn't call me, I called you, all right? Faith isn't something we earn. Faith isn't something we choose. Faith is a given. So we inherit it, but people, all inherited religions are beginning to detect a decline as people don't maintain their allegiance to the church of their birth. By the way, this is the whole new evangelization. The genius of John Paul II, who says, no longer, sadly, can we count on culture to transmit the faith. We used to be able to, but now look at the cultural nations of the world. Ireland, Italy, France. The culture doesn't transport the faith anymore. In fact, the culture's opposed to it. So we can't count on culture. And we can't even presume the family is going to naturally do it. Should, most of the time still does. It's sure great when it does, but we can't presume it anymore, can we? That's the new evangelization that we have to reclaim. We have to, again, let the gospel preach to us and let Jesus claim us personally. So I think that's a great chore that he's got. And I think what he's saying is, well, one of the things we can begin to do is brighten up the image of the church. Because we have to correct the church as this harsh, nagging, naysaying, crabby, exclusive bunch of crabs. Because nobody wants to join those. Now, he's not alone. Benedict, I mentioned affirmative orthodoxy, John Paul, restoration of the soul. They've all done that. He's doing it in a particularly tender way, and I think that's his pastoral challenge.
Your Eminence, my family and many people who really don't practice at times have been astounded by the joy of Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. And this evening, Monsignor Tubes recognized your joyfulness. And with everything that you do, with the business, with the closer you get to the church, the dirt, the ugliness that sometimes you see, how do you maintain your joy? and how do you continue to live that out?
Beer. I'm sorry, I didn't see, not beer at all. Not beer at all. Jameson. Preferably 18-year-old. 18-year-old Jameson, which my father said was a damn lie, because no self-respecting Irishman would let it sit around that long, all right? Well, you know what? I think I think it goes back to what John Paul II would have said. Thank you. I mean, I see a very joyful house here. I see a very joyful crowd here this evening. Joy is one of the marks of the church, and you are right in that Pope Francis himself is immensely joyful and exudes a sense of joy. But and thank you for thinking that I do. I try. It's a gift that's not joy is a virtue. A virtue is ours for the asking. Okay, so we ask for an increase of joy. And St. Thomas Aquinas would remind us in his Symphony of the Virtues that joy is under basically the subheading of the virtue of hope. Because if we believe that everything is in God's hands, if we believe, as St. Paul says, that all will work out for those who believe, well, then you really never let things destroy you. You get discouraged, you get exhausted, you get weary, but you never really let it oppress you, because you know in the long run it can't. Because the victory is ours. I guess it's like the first reading today. Defeats will come, but victory is ours. And so, as John Paul would say, if you believe that in the depth of your soul, well, then you're going to be a person of joy. What Pope Francis is, well, I had the honor when it was my last visit in Rome in October. I was president of the Bishops' Conference, and Archbishop Kurtz, the Archbishop of Louisville, who succeeded me, he and I were over every October. The president and vice president go to visit the heads of the different curial offices. And we had 40 minutes with Pope Francis, and it was a beautiful meeting. And when we were there, a number of times the attendants would come in and say, "Holy Father, you must go. You're running late. So finally, when it came time for us to go, he says, let me walk you to the door. And I said, "Holy Father, you don't have to walk us to the door." And he says, "Yes, I want to make sure you're leaving." He said he's got a personal sense of humor, and he likes to tease, and he is a man of joy. But that just comes, I think, from, again, the soul, because that's where that virtue is found.
Last question from one of our first theologians.
I just want to say, Cardinal, you have a great first name, by the way.
Timothy, there you go.
Yeah,
our feast day's coming up, right?
It's coming up. It's
January 26th.
There you go. I have a question. Pope Francis, or you mentioned in your talk about smelling like the sheep, and that's, I think, a good characteristic of our Pope. We've seen pictures of him, reaching out to, like you said, the poor and walking through slums and drinking common drinks with the people. Reading his exhortation recently, he comments about, in a kind of a concrete way, on kind of shaping the ministry of pastoral workers of ordaining us future priests and the laity. Could you comment more maybe on your experience being the cardinal there in New York, how to kind of get out in this style of Pope Francis, how to kind of get out of, in a concrete way, out of the structure of the parish and really like reach those who've maybe fallen away from the church, and how to do that in kind of a concrete way, like what he's talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. Well, Pope Francis does that for sure. This is interesting, folks, because a lot of people ask me about him, because there's just this immense fascination with Francis. I can't go anywhere in New York without cab drivers, garbage collectors, homeless people, businessmen, bartenders, waiters saying, "We love this new Pope. Thanks for electing him." And it is his joy, and it's his common touch there. But this is interesting. For him, it's not a marketing strategy. Now, for instance, let's say a new president or a new governor. If he were going in to take over, professionals technical consultants would meet with him and say, Mr. President or Governor, here's what you need to do, all right? So you need to go pay your own hotel bill, and you need to carry your own bags, and you need to live at Doma Santa Marta, and you need to dress simply, and you need to embrace the poor. He doesn't have a strategy. He doesn't have some marketing strategy. This is just him. He does it very naturally. When the morning after the election, the tradition is that all the cardinals gather again for Mass in the Sistine Chapel. So we're there to vest in the Aula Benedizione, and the Pope is to vest in a room off to the side. And so we're all there vesting, and we all of a sudden see Pope Francis walk in, and he's carrying his own alb, and he's carrying his own mitre, and of course the attendants kind of gather around him, about 12 Monsignori, and say, Holy Father, you vest in here, and here's and he, with very gently, in a non-judgmental way, he just said, oh, thank you, fathers. Stay close. I may need you, but I've been saying Mass for 50 years. That's okay. All right? It was very, very natural. He loved him. He was smiling. He said, stay close. I may need you. I have some questions, but that's okay. You don't need to be worried about me. He was very, very natural. Now, here's the one thing I would say, Timothy, to your question. There's only one thing I would correct you on. He says, how do we get out of the parish? I think the best way is to think of wherever you're at as your parish. Now, one of the great titles that I've seen given to Pope Francis is the world's parish priest. He's the world's parish priest. Now, that's a great compliment to you guys who want to be parish priests. It's one of the greatest titles of honor the church can give somebody, a pastor, a parish priest. When I was rector in Rome, I knew after that 7 years I was going home, and my own archbishop at the time, Justin Regali, called at Easter, and he said, Tim, you're coming home. What would you like to do? Back in St. Louis. And good priest that I was, and shrewd priest that I was, I said, Archbishop, whatever you want me to do. All right? And he said, okay, fine, thank you. He said, now, would you help me? He was shrewd, too. He said, would you help me decide what I would like to ask you to do by telling me what you'd like to do? This could have gone on for a while. I see you husband and wives looking at one another. This is what. So I finally said, all right, Archbishop, thanks for asking. I'd love to be a pastor of a parish. I had been for 9 years earlier, but I'd love to be a pastor of a parish. And I'd love to be a parish priest again. He said, okay, well, I go home as his auxiliary bishop. And when I got there, I teased him. I said, you promised me I was going to be a pastor, a parish priest. And he said, well, you are. The Archdiocese of St. Louis is your parish. I'm the pastor. You're my assistant. All right? So he said, this is our parish. Now, that's not a bad model. See, that's not a bad model. So now I got a parish of 2.8 million souls in the Archdiocese of New York. But if you look at it as your parish, not a structure, not a corporation, not a job, not a business, because Pope Francis has a parish of 1.2 billion souls. And it's very clear that he's our parish priest. So I think Timothy, that's the key, to look at wherever you're at, whether you're a rector of a seminary, whether you're a chancellor of the Archdiocese, whether you're a teacher, like one of the excellent faculty here. These are the souls that you're tending, because we have the care of souls. We're shepherds. We're parish priests. I think that's it. Monsignor, is that enough, you
Amen.
think?
Eminence,
Yeah.
if you would be seated for a moment, I invite us all into a moment of prayer.
Beautiful.
Our seminarians are going
for
to
that.
lead us in the words of the angel Gabriel
Beautiful.
to Our Lady, and so we'll close with a meditation on the Hail Mary.
Good idea.
Prince, would you give us your blessing?
I would, if Archbishop Kelleher and Bishop Barbarito join me. Come on. We might as well give them their money's worth. All right. All right. Come on, Jim. All right. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit,
Blessed be the name of the Lord.
now and forever,
Our help is in the name of the Lord.
who made heaven and
The
earth.
Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Praise be Jesus Christ.
Now and forever. Let us thank His Eminence. Wonderful. Yeah, stay here, stay here. A couple of housekeeping items. There is a reception in the refectory if you would like to go to the refectory. In just a moment, I'm going to invite